dates from when I retired in 2007. I live alone in a 3-storey townhouse in Glebe, and I don't want anybody currently living under a bridge to come and live with me in my 3-storey townhouse in Glebe where I live alone. My interest in housing dates from 2007 when UniSuper lost a big lump of my retirement savings in the global financial crisis. So I closed down my UniSuper account and lent the money to my one child to buy a house. At that time, I noticed that bloody old, what's his name, who writes for the Sydney Morning Herald, appeared to write absolute shit from my perspective as a woman. I've never bought housing as an investment. I bought it to bring up a child in and to house my lovers while I worked on a really big screw for Sydney University. A bit like a lot of you people here, probably. I've got 2 questions. I want to know why people in Amnesty International appear to have so much contempt for the Chinese who actually grasped what the one-child policy was all about in providing housing and raising the whole world, not just their own population out of poverty. And I want to know why people like you two have provided such a piss-weak, labour-cheering, useless and unclear set of platitudes for so many years in comparison with somebody like Jessica Irvine, who was the first person who I've ever seen to write an article who made any clear, plain common sense.
But can I just, you've asked the question, can we just now deal with it? Okay, so can I just, before I hand over to our speakers, indicate that one of the key campaigns of Amnesty International has been to, no, please hear me out. I mean, you've had your say, now it's our turn, madam. Amnesty International has campaigned vigorously and passionately and authentically for a Human Rights Act in Australia that listen to me please, that has a statutory provision in the same or similar terms to Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is very important, so please don't, please don't unfairly criticise the very genuine work that Amnesty and other advocacy organisations are trying to do. So that's my response, but I'm not here to... What I'm now going to do is to invite our guest speakers to respond to your question.
My comment would be, I really like Jessica Irvine's writings about housing as well, and the reason I like them is because she's someone sitting in the rental market, and she was explaining a lot of the angst that David was trying to talk about in terms of how the rental market has been working for her, and how renters in a lot of ways in Australia are portrayed as second-class citizens in comparison to rental rights in other countries. We really portray rental as a temporary tenure, when for so many people it's a permanent tenure, and certainly for a lot of young people that previously got into home ownership, it will be the tenure for the rest of their life. Other than that, I'm not exactly sure what else I could say, but I'll hand it over to my colleague David.
Look, thanks. And look, just to add to it, Philip's absolutely right. Jessica, I guess, she differs from a lot of the economics writers in the media in that she's a young person, one, and she's a female, two, most are older men, so you get a great perspective from the point of view of young people. So her perspective is absolutely valid. Many young people feel locked out of the housing market. Apart from that, look, maybe we should have a basket of tomatoes on the side, and if any of you feel that you need to throw them at a Labor politician, I'm more than happy to do that. I was only elected last year. Give me a go. And social democratic politics is a tough old business, and you will often make as many enemies as you do friends, and it's burned out a lot of people and it's disappointed a lot of people. But I think when you look at the span of human history, social democrats and socialists have, by and large, tried to do the right thing for humanity, and I'm hoping I can make a little contribution to that point of view as well.
Thank you for your talk. The CFMEU Construction Union has placed an interim green ban on the Sirius building at the Rocks, which has been a public housing establishment for over 30 years and is now slated for redevelopment into hundreds of private apartments. It is one of the last areas of public housing remaining in the district. CFMEU New South Wales Secretary Brian Parker states the top end of town moves in and ordinary working people are locked out of the suburbs they called home for more than a century. Houses are no longer seen as homes for living in, but rather as a source of profit. Do you think this links up with the pervasive neoliberalism that has infected our political discourse? A doctrine that has been described as little more than personal greed dressed up as an economic philosophy, or, in accordance with Joseph Stiglitz, what is sold nowadays as economics is in reality a self-serving ideology, or perhaps a form of fundamentalist religion. And my further question, do you think that the new generation that permanently excluded from home ownership will provide a constituency to fight for major improvements in tenants' rights, similar to what they have in Europe?
To answer your second question, absolutely. And if you look at our opponents, I guess Labor's opponents on the left, the Greens, they see tenants' rights as a big issue for them. But Labor does as well, and there's a whole bunch of people in the Labor caucus that are passionate about doing more for renters' rights, because we do need to move away from the idea that everybody should try and move into a house. It certainly doesn't need to be the aim of everybody. There's a whole bunch of successful European countries, Germany in particular, where renting is the norm. But these things have to happen over time. It's a cultural thing. The culture in this country has been built on home ownership. I think we're at a point in our history where we need to, because of the size of our country and where people want to live, we're going to head in one or two directions. One is to social dislocation with people being priced out and underclasses developing, or we're going to move to a situation where we do address the need to make sure everybody's accommodated in society in a fair way, and that includes renters as well. So the current changes proposed to tenants' law are very minor. At least they didn't take away tenants' rights. There weren't many there, but at least the current government hasn't diminished them. But certainly there's a whole bunch more we can do for tenants to improve their rights, and it is a constituency. That young person's constituency does want action on housing, and they're going to be having arguments with their parents who aren't really thinking about it. Their parents are people my age who can see the wealth that's just been accumulated just by sitting doing nothing in a house. There's accumulated wealth that we bought 10, 20 years ago. Their children won't allow that to continue. It's going to be an interesting time to be part of socially progressive politics, and I'm really quite happy to contribute to that.
Okay, let me say something about Sirius, because I think David's done a very good job answering the second question. Sirius has got to be the most bizarre example of contemporary policy, like I've seen. Sirius is an old apartment building. It was built specifically to house people that had been displaced from some of the redevelopment down the Rocks. The process in New South Wales is something called the Heritage Council, which is appointed by the government, that makes decisions, it makes recommendations to a minister. Minister Speakman is responsible for heritage. The Heritage Council unanimously recommended that Sirius be listed, and the minister said, look, I don't care about the heritage, I'm just worried about the fact that it's a government-owned building, and if I heritage list it, the government will lose money. So you had a heritage minister who started to sound like he was a private sector developer and not a government minister. Now, it got worse than that. So the heritage minister was sounding like the finance minister, and then about a week later, the finance minister wrote an op-ed in the Sydney Morning Herald saying he thought the place looked like a car park and that it should be demolished. So the finance minister suddenly decides he's a heritage expert. Now, meanwhile, all the poor people that were living down Millers Point, whose houses have been sold up underneath them, that could have relocated into the Sirius building and lived the rest of their life out in peace in Millers Point, weren't given that opportunity. And I just think it's just such a bizarre turn. You know, and one of the things we teach in the faculty at the University of Sydney is heritage, and my colleague who's a heritage expert just thinks it's set a very dangerous precedent. Every developer in Sydney will now say, well, you shouldn't list my building as a heritage building because it's going to cost me money, and I've got less money than the New South Wales government, so you should listen to me and not list it. So I'm not exactly sure who is the heritage minister in New South Wales, because the one we've got doesn't seem all that interested in heritage. So I think it's been a terrible outcome, not only for heritage, but certainly for the people of Millers Point, who've had their terrace houses sold underneath them, that could have relocated in a Sirius that isn't an old building. It was only built in the 70s. It basically was built as an affordable housing building that a wide range of people, including the president of the Architectural Association, is now running a campaign called Save Our Sirius. I'm participating, and I'd encourage people who are interested to get involved.
Okay. Do you see the Greater Sydney Commission having a role in providing more affordable housing? Do you think it can?
Yeah, I think it can play a role. Certainly, as as described before, there's something called inclusionary zoning, which is a planning strategy. And in inclusionary zoning, you've got to provide a certain proportion of any development at particular affordable housing price points. I think members, the commissioners at the commission, are making some positive noises about that space. I guess it's just a matter of whether those actions around affordable housing are taken up with gusto. But we'll know soon enough. The district plans are coming out towards the end of the year. And if they don't do anything about affordable housing, I think the citizens of Sydney should shout their house down, because here's an opportunity. It's a new body. There's some new plans coming out. We really got to do something, otherwise the horse is going to have bolted.
I'll only add that yes, it's a planning issue, and if I look at my area, the Central Coast, we have a draft plan the government's released. It talks about the need for certain numbers of housing, but there's no target for affordable housing, and the comment I made was we need a target for affordable housing and a pathway to get there in the plan. If you don't plan for it, you'll never get it. The Commission has the opportunity to do that, so I guess it's up to all of us to push when we can to make sure planning includes inclusionary zoning, affordable housing as well.
As you were speaking, I agree with everything you're saying, but another dimension I'd like you to address a little bit. I kept on thinking Stiglitz, and Piketty. We're all aware of who he is, Piketty. And reading Piketty, a bit of Piketty, he talks about the rentiers, that is, people who make their income, large income, by doing no work and simply having the means to be able to buy investment property. But what makes that more alluring to these parasites, actually, because it's a parasitical approach, is negative gearing. So there's an economic issue. I really want you to address a little bit the economics of it. What is underway about challenging the whole negative gearing, the whole thing that's driving the investment by people who don't actually live there themselves, probably charge excessive rates to the poor people who have to rent. But it's way in which the distribution of income is being skewed so much more to the upper middle class or beyond, and to the terrible disadvantage of the rest of us. So would you like to sort of address that?
Sure. Look, I mean, without doubt, the owners of capital still have an advantage that must be addressed. And if you've got a 50% discount on capital gains, then the owners of capital will always have an advantage over the wage earner whose tax is deducted PAYE as he or she earns it. All I can say is federal Labor has got it, and it was a hard policy to get through the party, and to his credit, the Treasurer, Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen, is determined to pursue it. And unless we address that tax problem, where capital is more is taxed in a different way to wages, then we won't address the imbalances in our society. So Labor's certainly shown that they've got they're determined to do something about it, and they're continuing to talk about it even though they lost the election. So that shows a tremendous amount of courage, and I want to give Chris Bowen all the credit he's due for doing that. And if we keep talking that way, and if good people support that point of view, we'll have results out there. So we just need to keep talking about it and sticking to our guns on the issue.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think you've raised, a very interesting point, and I think that's been one of the drivers of house price inflation. Investors have got a very good deal. They run hard at the market when prices go up. And they just see basically housing as a form of wealth accumulation. They're not interested sometimes in being long-term landlords. They tend to turn properties over. That has bad impacts on renters, as it's been already mentioned. I think one of the opportunities might be to try and direct investment in rental housing away from essentially speculators to some long-term institutional investment. There's now some moves to try and get superannuation funds, including industry funds, interested in investing in long-term affordable housing. Some things have got to happen probably for that to eventuate. But in a market like that, where you've got people interested in rental yields from the long term, you don't get the evicting people because the owner wants to sell the house. If the superannuation fund wants a long, steady stream of revenue out of rents, you can set a system up, particularly in a low-yield world that we're living in, where people can pay affordable rents, and there can be some reasonable returns for investors. And I'm thinking particularly industry and other super funds that might be interested in that long-term yield. To do that, you've got to combine it with some things like inclusionary zoning, but I think that would be an opportunity. I think at the moment, people that are just trying to make a quick buck make terrible landlords, and negative gearing and capital gains just compounds that problem.
All right, I have very little confidence that our governments will do much about this. And the reason for it, my question will address this, is that I don't think you really understand the problem. The first problem is, I'm not sure how you describe it, but basically it goes like this. Why doesn't the government follow the example of New York City and London to solve or ameliorate the rental problem or the housing crisis? These cities got apartment builders or owners to dedicate some of their apartments to the street people. That can happen, and it should happen because you got the power of state to do it. But I don't think you do it because these are the people who donate money to both parties. So I don't think you're going to bite the thing that feeds you. The second, such as Harry Triggerboff, he's got more than enough money that he can afford to give a couple of those places away. Now the second point is political and geographic. The reason we haven't done this, and the reason you're not going to do it, is because the issue is a longer term issue. It requires you to decentralize. When I came to Australia in '68, decentralization was on the cards. It's not on the cards now. The way you can decentralize is to move the industries, move to other factories, and build businesses out of Sydney the population will follow. That will lower the amount of demand there, and it'll bring the market back to its senses. We've got to decentralize in all capital cities. There's just too much focus on and centralization in the capital cities. Stop it. Thank you.
Judging by your accent, you're Canadian. Okay, I almost called you an American, which got me into trouble. One of the things that's very different about Australian cities compared to Canadian, particularly US cities, is we've got very little choice in Australia about where we live. We've got a very limited number of large cities. In the US, there's literally dozens of cities greater than 1 million people. In Australia, in a lot of fields, if you want to pursue your career, you've essentially got a choice of Sydney or Melbourne. And that's one of the reasons that drives up house prices in those places. You've got so many people that want to live there because that's the only place they can basically ply their craft. I think that some things around technology are helping that. I think there is a bit of a movement for some people to move further away. For instance, the entrance and telecommute or work part-time in Sydney, but be able to maintain a business outside Sydney. I think that'll help. But no, I do take your point. I think that looking at trying to broaden the opportunities where people can live would really help. The other point about New York City, I actually just spent some time there. Made a short video that I might share with Philip about their inclusionary zoning system. And you've got no choice now. If you're a developer in New York and you build a large development, you've got to provide 25 to 30%. Barangaroo in Sydney's got an affordable housing requirement. It is so small you can hardly count it. 2.6%. It's like on a world scale, I don't know what we're doing. When I go to international conferences, the planning epidemic, and I say we've got an affordable housing requirement and it's 2.6%, seriously, people are polite, they don't laugh, but they're thinking, what are you guys smoking down there? Well, every other large, harbourside development or large regeneration project like Barangaroo in New York, it's 25 to 35. In Europe, it's higher, it's 35 to 40. And it's a government site. And they say, okay, guys, you can have the land. Here's the deal. You've got to provide some things the public wants. What does the public want in a major city? They want some housing they can afford to live in. So I actually think that there's a real lot of opportunities in that inclusionary, zoning space. We're talking about America. We're talking about New York City. It's hardly, the center of radical left policies, but they've come to the conclusion, like a lot of other world cities, that you've got to actually do something mandated through a government process, otherwise it just won't happen.
Exactly. And New York's a good example of a progressive politician that built his campaign around affordable housing. The Mayor de Blasio, central to his campaign was making sure affordable housing was addressed. And that touches on your point over here, that there's a constituency out there that a progressive constituency that we can talk to, that'll back us to make this thing happen. Other than that, in terms of decentralisation, look, you're absolutely right. I know you might want to chuck a tomato at me, but Labor's in the past done a bunch of things to decentralise. We had Albury-Wodonga, which is a successful city in its own right now because the government decided it would become a regional centre. We also did the same with the Bathurst and the Orange area. Probably less successful nowadays for some other reasons, but that's about decentralisation as well, and we need to do that in New South Wales. My area of the Central Coast is half a success story in terms of decentralisation. We made sure we had a water supply up there to cope for the current population. The last Labor government moved the whole work cover authority to the Central Coast. A whole bunch of jobs, nearly 1,000 moving into the area, which then multiplies into other jobs. The current government has moved most of those people back to Sydney. So decentralisation is absolutely important, and we should be looking at doing that in other regional centres, mainly out in the west, that Tamworth, that Albury area. There's some fantastic areas out there where people would really love to live, but they've got to be given an economy to work in as well, and decentralisation certainly should be part of the affordable housing strategy.
First of all, congratulations to the two speakers on wonderful contributions tonight, and my sympathies to Peter on the departure of his mother not so long ago, who
Thank
my
you.
daughter and I used to have cups of tea with down at Marketown to try and bridge the generation gap.
Excellent.
Prior to her departure when she was living in the nursing home in Marion Street. And congratulations to the newly elected ALP member in the Gosford region. I was up there yesterday with my two granddaughters delivering a potty for potty training, a wooden throne, and I glanced at the Central Advocate and noticed the article of the Nurses Union leading the anti-privatisation of Wyong Hospital going on, which sort of overlaps with the privatisation of everything else, which leads me to my question of who really runs New South Wales? Is it Mr. Jamie Packer and his bending of the rules on how many extra floors he can put on Banger-oo, Mr. Harry Triggerbooth, who says he's going to build lots and lots and lots more flats because we need them, because as the media pointed out this week, another 350,000 people are going to be jammed into the inner west, according to the Inner West Courier yesterday. I don't think we have a democracy that is represented here on the platform by the opposition party or a professor of politics sitting on numerous chairs and numerous overseas tours. Just like a month ago when we had someone from the Planning Commission for the City of Sydney here talking, it seems to me that power resides elsewhere. Now, when it comes to housing, it was the Communist Party who led the Unemployed People's Workers' Union in the Depression to squat in Union Street, Erskineville and at Bankstown, and they took on the coppers with all the community support. In the 70s, it was the Communist Party with Jack Mundy that did that. Throughout Europe, it was the anarchists in Berlin and Amsterdam that had thousands and thousands of people squatting to preserve housing because no one can afford the housing there. And we're almost getting to that crisis now where Parliament and committees that professors sit on become totally irrelevant because Baird is bulldozing all over us. And I think it'll be a while before the stench of the Labor Party and the Eddie Abeeds of this world gets out of people's nostrils when all the corruption down at the Rocks went on with the shyster deals over liquor trading there from the former police minister running, rate-free mercantile pub and another shyster given the contract to the old sailors' home and so on and so forth. But if you want seriousness here in this article, you mentioned, Peter, the Sydney Morning Herald article. You didn't mention the Daily Telegraph one where the minister for whatever basically made the point that if they demolish Sirius, I'm nearly finished, if they demolish Sirius, the building, they will build a skyscraper for billionaires and it will be $70 million for the poor social housing out Penrith Way. Do you think that will come to fruition? That's my question to you. Will the money be reallocated, and will the poor blind lady in the penthouse apartment live to see out her days there, which is what the Telegraph is saying?
Thanks, comrade. Thanks for your question.
Now, look, that was great. It was a traditional question at an event like this that was also a speech, and that's what I love about these sorts of events. Look, if you ask the government, what they're doing is they call it asset recycling. They are selling properties in Millers Point which are valuable, and they say they'll reinvest the money back into provision of public housing. The trouble is they're losing a whole bunch of houses in the process, and they're spending a whole bunch of money to evict these people and move them somewhere else. They've got to house the people who currently have a home at Millers Point while they go about the process of selling and providing the new homes. the multiplier effect at the end of the day isn't that great. If you look at the number of public housing units, dwellings over the last, it's now 6 years of Conservative government, it's actually declined slightly. So the government strategy is a failure, but it's a strategy aimed at its core, at its heart, at privatising and then spending that money and hoping the spend is enough to get them through at the end of the day. But it has its limits, and I think it's certainly had its limits in the last week where the Health Minister is now announcing privatisation of our hospitals. So we've now got 5 hospitals in New South Wales that will be run by the private sector. That is unheard of. Even in Conservative politics, Thatcher didn't even contemplate that sort of way of handling the conduct of business for the state. Look, it'll bring them undone at the end of the day, no doubt. And the strategy of providing public housing by selling other public housing is also going to be a failure in the long term. It doesn't provide enough. It's as simple as that. The government, look, at the bottom line is the government at the moment, through the bond rates are so cheap right now. It is cheaper for the government to build houses than the private sector could ever hope to. And that's the way to address the problem, and that's, as I spoke about. Bond rates are so slow, the government can borrow money cheaper than the private sector right now. The multiplier effect by building homes, affordable homes for people, would be much greater in this state. Building affordable homes in decentralised areas as well would be much greater than the current government strategy, which is selling existing public housing and hoping that you'll be able to build additional replacement public housing. It's going to fail, it'll unravel, but you've got a 4-year term in the state, and I guess we've got another couple of years before people have another chance to cast their vote.
No, thanks for the question, Jefferson. I'm not exactly sure now what the question is, but could I just mention, Jefferson, that we've known each other for a long time. I met Jefferson at university. 44 years. 44 years. Can I recount the story, Jefferson? Would you mind if I recounted the story about your graduation that Can I?
I want you to justify you selling out, becoming a professor.
Okay. Let's talk about that. Okay, I won't talk about it. It was my favourite ever graduation, Jefferson. I'll coming up and ask me later if you want. I shouldn't say it in public. Okay, I did become a professor. I just remembered that. I will say, Jefferson, that I will never ever sit on another affordable housing task force. Okay, that was a complete waste of my time. It was a con. I admit I was conned, and I've said it several thousand times in public, and I think I've probably broken several laws about revealing secrets of working parties in public venues like this. I agree with you. There's a lot of.
Knock off the biscuits and bring them along.
Yeah. Okay. I should bring the biscuits. I should have shared the biscuits. I think the thing, Jefferson, I completely agree. There's a lot of shadowy figures behind what's going on in New South Wales at the moment. I think some of the public policy is probably the worst we've seen since Bob Askin.
I wish I understood it.
I don't understand current public policy either. And, I'm very sympathetic. And hopefully we can have some improvements. I almost think it's a terrible thing, Jefferson, we used to talk about that. Things have got to get really bad for things to get better. And I just think things are so bad and people are so cranky about what's going on in their city. I actually think there's some opportunities for some fundamental change. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks to the panel. Look, the question to me is actually where the fundamental culture of corruption, which is endemic in the history of our country, and if you look at the history of Sydney, it goes back to the start. I think that what we're seeing today with this Baird government is the most corrupt government that we've had, and that leaves beside Bob Askin and quite a few others. All the projects to do with housing, to do with public transport, to do with the dealing of the foreshores, it's all corruption. And they're proposing to knock down the public housing towers at Waterloo in order to build private apartments, which is going to be used to fund their private railway line. And that's another aspect of the whole thing that I think needs to be looked at. They're looking at running a railway line through Rozelle and taking over the parkland at Rozelle, at Cullen Park. There's so many issues here where every aspect of public policy of this government, in my view, is corrupt. It's to do with developers. It's to do with the fact that the government is made up of developers or former bankers. I think that there will be no solution to this housing question unless we actually tackle the whole question of the interrelation of politics and corruption and big business in this country, and you just can't separate those. So I just wonder if you'd comment on this fact that every aspect of public policy, housing, public transport, planning is completely tied up through this period government. Thank you.
Well, I guess, yeah. Look, it is historic. I mean, the building that I work in when I'm in Parliament, which used to be a hospital, was called the Rum Hospital. It was built by a builder who was granted the monopoly to import rum to the colony of New South Wales because the colony had no money. In many ways, the approach of the current government is not much different to that. Their view of the world is that the government should not borrow money, even though it is cheaper than it ever has been for a government to borrow money in this state. They don't want to do it because they're philosophically opposed to the idea of the government or the state doing anything. So they are giving parts of the public arena. They're giving the right to run roads. They're giving the right to operate hospitals. They're selling off public land. They're selling off public buildings in the CBD. They're giving over to the public sector all these assets and hoping that they get a bit of money in return to fund, well, some other roads, but also to operate government services. It'll run its course, I'm afraid. I appreciate that a lot of people, were disappointed with the way the former state Labor government ran the state, but certainly we didn't hurt people the way people are being hurt at the moment, the most vulnerable people in our society. And I think it builds in people's minds, it accrues, people can see there's a sense of unfairness growing out there. It'll be addressed. The young constituency that's not being provided houses will revolt. They'll revolt in a different way to the way Jeff was referring to. They don't need to march on the streets now. They'll talk amongst themselves. They'll talk on Facebook. But they'll have their way. They'll cast their vote. And their vote will be cast electronically because you can do that now at state elections, and they'll do it in greater numbers in the next state election. They'll run their own campaign, and they'll bring unseated the government that does not assure them a fair stake in society. So I've got a positive view of the future, and I think we can all be part of it if we keep having this sort of conversation.
My question is with regard to the framework that allows the corruption to happen. And first, let me refer to Joseph Stiglitz' Henry George effect. That land values grow in greater proportion to the expense of basic services and utilities built over it. And what does that say? The capital gains, the gains from land appreciation, has actually been financed by taxpayers and not by the lie that real estate developers earn their capital gains by enterprise. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, look,
let me finish.
Oh, sorry, go on.
The Harbour Bridge in Sydney was built during the Great Depression because the New South Wales government managed to recover its expense of building the bridge from the appreciated land values in the North Shore. Now, and the second framework that I really want to call attention here is, money has been lent into existence. You're wondering why interest rates have fallen. It's because when banks lend on the basis of you're wanting to buy land and real estate, your mortgage is actually handing over the land appreciation and economic rents of the land to them. And by doing so, you're wondering why interest rates are so low, yet land values are appreciating so high. So what are you going to do about the very wrong framework that nobody is attacking? Don't you think you should change your framework to prevent the very corruption that's happening right in front of our very faces?
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. Like economists call that the unearned increment. So a developer, would own some land near, say, one of the new railway lines that's appearing in Sydney. We've seen some examples, and one of my colleagues down the back has done some work on this, that you actually have an increase in land values when there's been an upzoning to accompany the infrastructure change of between 2.5 and 3 times. And I guess I would argue that we should be sharing that uplift, certainly between the landowner but the taxpayers that have paid for the infrastructure, but also provides a platform to provide some affordable housing in the vicinity. And a lot of times in those sort of projects, the more affordable housing stock gets knocked down and replaced by quite expensive housing. I actually think that's the point I was trying to make, probably not half as well as you, when I was saying we have some opportunities in Sydney because we actually are increasing land values through so many changes that we're making. If we actually tax that unearned increment, we actually could do a lot of really positive things to make our cities better and also to make some housing more affordable. And I think that's something I've been shouting out for a while, and I'm hoping that someone wants to pick that issue up. Essentially, we had a look at a block of land out near, a railway station on the Northern Line. The lot, basically nothing happened. It was a grass lot. The developer hardly mowed the lawn. And as a result of the railway station and the change in zoning, the piece of land he bought for $2.2 million sold for $6.6 million 3 years later. So why wouldn't you actually tax that uplift? The developer hasn't done anything, hasn't actually mowed the lawn, hasn't put any improvements on the land. They've just speculated on that change in use. And I think, there's someone's point about corruption. I think there'll be a very interesting strategy in actually looking at where there's been those windfalls, who's actually bought the land. It was a very strategic choice. And did they have some insights they probably shouldn't have in terms of, access to future decision making?
And were they Labor or Liberal?
Sure. Look, and Wynne talked about this as well. It's the advantages given to the rentier class, those who own capital over those who earn their income through wages. And there has been a bunch of discussion about this. There's been a bunch of discussion around introducing a land tax rather than relying on stamp duty for income in this state. And I'm aware that the Australian Capital Territory have gone in that direction in a significant way. And that's something that a lot of people in New South Wales are looking towards. I had an example in my area, the sandwich shop across the road from my office in the entrance. 3 self-employed women, single mothers, operating a sandwich shop at low rents. The landlord that was charging those low rents sold the property to another landlord. That landlord, because they were always busy, he thought they could pay more. He didn't want to do anything. He proposed no improvement to the property whatsoever. But he just bought it and he wanted to get some sort of greater income to meet his own expectations of what he should be achieving out of that property. He did nothing other than purchase the thing. He put the rent up. He put those ladies out of business. And now it's an empty shop. It's been empty for 4 months in my electorate in the main street, and that has a flow-on effect on the rest of the community. We need to capture those people in our society and make sure that we reward productive investment. We're not doing that at the moment with the capital gains discount that applies at the federal level, introduced by the Howard government. Capital gain for no work, no effort, no investment is rewarded disproportionately in this country. And look, I think its time has come. But like everything, we'll get there slower than we probably should, but I think we're going to get there sooner rather than later this time.